Good evening and welcome to Iveagh House, to the Department of Foreign Affairs, and to the first event in an occasional series to mark what will be more than a decade of commemorations to mark various centenaries associated with that momentous period in Irish history between 1912 and 1923. Those 11 years went by as fast as the years between 2001 and today. And I think it's always difficult for us imaginatively to capture that point, but to the participants, 11 years was as fast and as slow, and of course was so eventful. This evening we begin with a lecture from the First Minister of Northern Ireland, Mr. Peter Robinson, the Edwards Carson lecture, Reflections on Irish Unionism. But would you first welcome the Taoiseach and Minister for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Eamon Gilmore, TD.
Thank you very much, John, for your introduction. You are all very welcome to Iveagh House and to this first in a programme of commemorative events. The coming weeks will see the centenaries of events which in different ways have shaped our memory and our politics. The first mass demonstration against Home Rule at Balmoral on the 9th of April, the introduction of the third Home Rule Bill on the 11th of April, and the sinking of the Titanic on the night of the 14th, 15th of April. That April week, 100 years ago, was a momentous week. And it was followed in the succeeding months by the signing of the Ulster Covenant, the foundation of the Ulster Volunteers, the lockout, the formation of the Citizen Army and of the Irish Volunteers. This evening we are advancing a process of remembering together events which once divided us so profoundly, recalling the words of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth in Dublin Castle last year when she spoke of the complexity of our history, its many layers and traditions, of being able to bow to the past but not be bound by it. I want to pay a particular welcome to members of the Northern Ireland Executive, to First Minister Peter Robinson and Deputy First Minister Martin McGuinness, to the SDLP leader Alistair MacDonald, and to ministers and members of the Assembly from across the political spectrum who have travelled to join us tonight. I want to welcome representatives of the British government, and especially my colleague Secretary of State Owen Paterson, and of many other governments with whom we will soon be recalling the events of the First World War. I also want to acknowledge the presence this evening of the representatives from Belfast City Council, from the Oireachtas Consultative Group chaired by Minister Jimmy Deanahan, and the Advisory Group chaired by Dr. Maurice Manning, and of course by my colleague Minister Alan Shatter. This evening's programme considers Edwards Carson, a Dubliner, born a short distance from here in Harcourt Street in 1854, who played such an influential role in our history 100 years ago. Carson was no stranger to this house. 100 years ago, this was home to the Earl of Iveagh, Edward Guinness, a unionist, philanthropist, brewer, and the brother of Arthur Guinness, described by James Joyce as those two cunning brothers, lords of the vat. By then, Edward Carson was MP for Trinity College and leader of the Ulster Unionist Alliance. In 1913, he and Conservative Party leader Andrew Bonar Law stayed here at Iveagh House with Edward Guinness while visiting to Dublin to address a rally for Southern Unionists at the Theatre Royal on Friday, the 28th of November. It had been another momentous week. Dublin was in the grip of the lockout. That Monday, the 24th of November, the Irish Citizen Army had begun drilling in the ITGWU grounds in Fairview. Within 3 days, it had enrolled 1,200 members. On Tuesday, a new organisation, the Irish Volunteers, was launched at the Rotunda. On Thursday, the Irish Times published a letter from 150 businessmen, including Edward Guinness, warning of the dire commercial consequences of Home Rule. On Friday morning, Edward Carson and Andrew Bonar Law left Iveagh House to have lunch at the Kildare Street Club. On the front steps, they encountered a protest against the Conservative Party's opposition to votes for women. The protest was organised by the Irish Women's Franchise League and the Irish Women's Reform League. Two suffragettes, Hannah Sheehy-Skeffington and Meg Connery, broke through the police cordon. The scene was recorded by a photographer with The Independent. Bonner Law stands bemused as Meg Connery, hotly pursued by an officer of the Dublin Metropolitan Police, holds a poster before him. The two suffragettes ended up in police custody. Carson and Bonner Law continued on to lunch and attended the rally that evening, where the orchestra played ragtime and the Irish Times described the stage as a cave of Union Jacks. Ireland was in ferment, political and social. This was an era of greatness, great ambition, great achievement, but great failure too, and great opportunities missed. When we think of these centenaries, we inevitably think of the momentous political events that shaped Ireland, Great Britain and Europe. But that is only part of the story. Iveagh House has physically changed little since Edward Guinness lived here, but Edward Carson and Andrew Bonner Law stepped out that afternoon into a very different Dublin, one where 15,000 workers were locked out of their jobs, where a third of the population lived in slums and rates of TB were much higher than anywhere in England or Scotland. The collapse of two tenement buildings in Dublin that August had prompted an inquiry into the housing conditions of Dublin's working classes. The report published photographs of a Dublin that has now vanished, of tenements housing over 87,000 men, women and children in the inner city, many of them taken that same November during the lockout. Men, women and children can never rise to the best that is in them under such circumstances, the report concluded. Let us not lose sight then of how life was lived by most Irish people, whatever their politics, whether they lived in Robinson's cottages or McGuinness Court in Dublin's inner city, in Belfast, or indeed in Liverpool or New York. Politics has an unfortunate tendency to turn history to caricature and reduce complexity to a slogan. The events we are recalling had the effect of fixing national and religious identities for the decades that followed in a way that was exclusive and confrontational. Carson has been a notable victim of caricature. The man who came to personify unionism was an admirer of the Irish language and an opponent of partition. Republican leaders, too, have been too easily caricatured. Thomas MacDonagh's last lecture to his students in UCD before going out on Easter Monday was not on politics or even on Irish literature, but on Jane Austen. Ah, lads, he concluded the lecture, there's nobody like Jane. Over the decades that followed, we somehow lost a sense of comfort with our complex identities. I hope that through these commemorations, we will continue to regain that comfort. History, at its best, facilitates this. Though Carson's statue stands in Stormont and not on Leinster Lawn, he and the Southern Unionism he represented are a part of our political heritage. If we make a point of understanding how ordinary life was lived, we should ask how life was lived by more than 35,000 people in Donegal, Cavan and Monaghan who signed the Ulster Covenant. And what of the hundreds of Dubliners who attended the rally in the Theatre Royal that night in November? What became of them? What of the families of the Royal Irish Constabulary and the Dublin Metropolitan Police, 498 of them, who died in service between 1916 and 1918? What of those who fought in the southern regiments during the First World War, not to secure home rule, but simply to serve king and country? What of their families? The grief and loss endured quietly without adequate public acknowledgement. These centenaries are an opportunity also to recall those Irish men and Irish women whose memories we have neglected or even forgotten. They are an opportunity to acknowledge failures as well as successes, opportunities taken but also opportunities lost. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has been working with the county museums in Cavan, Donegal and Monaghan and with other partners in these counties to remember the local men and women who were drawn to the message and promise of the Covenant, but whose story has not often been told in the century since. Next September, we will be supporting exhibitions and public lectures across Donegal, Monaghan and Cavan that will explore their lives and stories and the effects on them of those turbulent months. Tonight's programme mixes history and politics. I'm grateful to Professor Paul Bew and Professor Michael Laffan for agreeing to share their thoughts on Carson's place in our history and his political legacy. I'm especially grateful to Dr. John Bowman for helping us to develop this programme and for agreeing to moderate the discussion. Of course, history belongs to all of us. Politics, at its best, is when it is informed by and draws inspiration from history. Every practitioner of politics is formed by those who came before. Edwards Carson played a little role in my own political development. Yet, as a Galway man with Dublin connections, I fully understand how Carson, the Dublin man with Galway connections, can be a thoughtful and instructive mentor. That is why I am particularly grateful to First Minister Peter Robinson for agreeing to offer his reflections on Carson's influence and on Irish Unionism as we enter this decade of commemoration. Peter Robinson is no stranger to Iveagh House. He visited shortly after the Anglo-Irish Agreement, not to take hospitality as Carson had done that day in November, but to protest as Hannah Sheehy Skeffington had done and Meg Connery had done on that occasion. Peter stood outside Iveagh House to remind us in an echo of Edward Carson that some 75 years later, Ulster still said no. Peter Robinson has also been working to address the caricatures handed to us by history. At his party conference last November, that traditional unionism as espoused by Edward Carson was never about prejudice, sectarianism, wrecking or division. He has demonstrated that in many ways since, not least in his attendance at the Armagh Tyrone McKenna Cup match. I invited Peter to speak in the conviction that this decade of commemorations is as much about looking forward as it is about looking back. Like the decade we are remembering, this decade is an opportunity to reimagine the Ireland that we want to leave to our children and to our grandchildren. How will they remember us when the anniversaries are recalled? Ideas emerge from debate. They are tested and adapted through debate, through listening to different voices. It is in that spirit that I invited Peter to address us this evening. I want to thank you, Peter, for travelling to join us tonight. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much. Tánaiste Secretary of State, Lord Mayor, Ministers, members of the Dáil and the Assembly, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I suppose the best thing about my opportunity tonight is that I get saying what I have to say, and it's going to be 2016 before Jerry and Martin can answer me. But I think it is fitting that the marking of this decade of centenaries should begin here in Dublin, the birthplace of the central figure of the era and the leader who formed and fashioned genuine traditional unionism. I am grateful, Eamon, for the invitation to deliver the Edward Carson lecture, and it is an honour to have such a notably distinguished audience. I think it's evidence of our collective determination that this decade of centenary shall contribute to creating greater understanding rather than promoting division. It's also, I think, a sign of real progress that Unionists and Nationalists can consider the events of a century ago in a spirit of respect, reconciliation and understanding of our shared history. Each of us, Unionist and Nationalist alike, as we recall the people and events of that era, which has so markedly shaped our lives, must take care to evaluate them on the timeless and enduring values, and by recognising that the tools and rules of engagement and of resolving differences have changed materially over the century. It's especially apt that we're gathered here at Iveagh House, just a short distance from the birthplace in 1854 of Edwards Carson. To nationalists, of course, Edwards Carson was the man who divided Ireland. To Unionists, he was the man who saved Ulster for the Union. But Edwards Carson was not merely another historical figure. He was the chief architect and creator of the Northern Ireland state, maintaining it against the odds as an integral part of the United Kingdom, a constitutional outcome that remains to this day. Politicians tend to focus and cite that segment of the life and times of great statesmen which best suits the case that they seek to make. I don't plead to be an exception to that rule, but perhaps I'll make an exception tonight. As a result, I think over the years, Edwards Carson has often been misunderstood by friend and by foe alike. His was a life of great achievement and drama, but he nonetheless experienced many unfulfilled desires and disappointed hopes. Though a statue of Lord Carson takes pride of place in front of Parliament buildings at Stormont, a Northern Ireland Parliament was an institution he had never sought. Though he did so much for unionism in Northern Ireland, he regarded the failure to retain the rest of Ireland in the United Kingdom as a massive loss. Paradoxically, his failure to achieve his preferred fallback position of retaining the 9 counties of Ulster in the Union probably in the longer term strengthened unionism. Equally ironic, the attempt by nationalists to confine the boundaries of Northern Ireland to much less than the present 6 counties by hacking off large portions of the border counties would have strengthened the Union even more. Nor was Carson the inflexible leader that has often been portrayed. Rather, he was a man who was prepared to compromise and alter direction when the situation demanded it. When it became clear that all of Ireland could not be saved for the Union, he sought to maintain the historic 9-county province of Ulster in the kingdom. And when that goal became unattainable, he cut a deal that preserved the 6 counties of what he termed statutory Ulster as part of the Union. He didn't blindly pursue lost causes in the name of what would ultimately be self-defeating principle. His hope and belief had been that success for Ulster would thwart the entire Home Rule project for Ireland. It's ironic that the one part of Ireland which in 1912 didn't want a local parliament within the Union was the only part of Ireland that ultimately got it. Edwards Carson was a giant figure, not just in Ulster or Irish politics, but on the national stage. By national, I of course refer to the British nation. He held several key cabinet positions. He resisted the urging of colleagues at Westminster to challenge and replace the then Prime Minister. Remarkably, he's one of a handful of non-monarchs to have received a state funeral in the United Kingdom. And if I tell you that the others include Winston Churchill, the Duke of Wellington, and Horatio Nelson, I think you'll begin to recognise what a testament it is to the standing and life and history of Edwards Carson and his place within the British nation. He was a relatively rare, though engaging, conviction-led politician. He was a man who always put the case to which he was devoted above any self-interest. Those close to him accused him of lacking ambition. He agreed, and undoubtedly he would have risen to the top national office if he had actually desired it. But tonight, rather than indulging in large slices of history, I want to suggest that 100 years on, we from the Unionist tradition, the inheritors of the Carson legacy, have a real opportunity to build the kind of Northern Ireland which Lord Carson envisaged. Edwards Carson would not be what in today's terms might be considered a stereotypical unionist. Though he became the leader of Ulster Unionism, his origins are, of course, in Dublin. He defined himself as a liberal unionist. He had a thick Dublin brogue. He had leading nationalists amongst his close friends, and though leading the cause of Ulster, he was always proud to call himself Irish. He wanted to keep Ireland united and within the Union, and he repeatedly sought accommodation with his nationalist fellow countrymen. As part of the settlement, Carson and Craig set structures in place to encourage harmony and cooperation between the two parts of Ireland. I believe he would have regretted that it took almost a century for relations between the two new states to reach the level that he had envisaged. But if we are to do justice to the past, we must see all of it, and not just some parts of the picture. George Mitchell once remarked that people in the United States knew too little of their history, while people in Northern Ireland knew too much. I suspect the truth is that too many of our people know too much of a partial and selective version of history, but little or nothing of the perspective of some others. You will have heard of Zhou Enlai's response when Nixon asked the Chinese premier for his views on the French Revolution, which had occurred 2 centuries earlier. "It's too early to say," he replied. Well, in this case, perhaps it is still too early to say what the real significance of the events of 1912, that decade, have been. But having in this generation achieved a well-established political settlement and enjoyed a new era of peace and community stability, I believe we can, for the first time, look back in a more objective and considered way than has been the case in the past. There's no doubt the island of Ireland in 2012 is a world away from that of 1912, or for that matter, the Ireland of most of the decades in between. For us, the past really is a foreign country. Today, relationships between the United Kingdom and Ireland, between Northern Ireland and the Republic, and within Northern Ireland, have been and are being transformed. It's not happened quickly or without considerable pain. That it has taken 100 years to achieve must be greatly lamented. Her Majesty the Queen, speaking in Dublin Castle last year, rightly counselled us all to bow to the past, but not be bound by it. So, before I turn to the issue of unionism today, let me bow to the past, to the heroes, the defenders, the brave and the wise. Let me briefly offer a few thoughts on the events of 100 years ago from the perspective of a unionist from this century. In doing so, I acknowledge that even viewing through the prism of hindsight is not perfect in assessing the events of that time. In examining historical proceedings, I am not an absolutist. I accept that just as there are many interpretations of modern-day events, so too will we find a myriad of opinions about the great passage of our history relating to 1912. So unapologetically, I'll give you my opinion. Looking back now, it's easy for us to conclude that in 1912, with the changes to the powers of the House of Lords, it was only a matter of time before Ireland, or at least a large part of it, would achieve home rule or independence of some kind. But more controversially, the benefit of hindsight should also lead us to conclude that the desire of Ulster to remain on the same terms within the Union and to be prepared to fight for it was not an unreasonable position to adopt. The northeast of Ireland was peopled by an identifiably distinct people. Of course, Britain could eject them from the Union, but having done so, Britain had no local standing or authority to determine that Ulster should be incorporated within a united Ireland. We should remember that today the right of self-determination for the people of Northern Ireland is a fundamental cornerstone of the political process. Perhaps if the right to consent, which is so widely accepted today, had been accepted in 1912, the history of the last century might have been very different. The signing of the Ulster Covenant and the events that were to follow were seen by Unionists as a struggle for their very existence, as an endeavour to cleave to all that they cherished and held dear. The introduction of the Third Home Rule Bill represented the start of a most perilous period for Unionism. For Unionists, what was at stake was economic prosperity and religious freedom. At this point, Ulster was the economic powerhouse on the island, and there was a real fear that Home Rule would threaten the prosperity of the people of the northeast of the island. Indeed, Carson believed that Ireland without Ulster would not have been economically viable. Those who see the response of Carson and his fellow Unionists as an overreaction to Home Rule failed perhaps to recognise that the inevitable outcome of Home Rule was complete independence. Unionists in 1912 saw their very way of life as being under threat, and consistent with the modus operandi of the age, were prepared to go to whatever lengths necessary to defend their position. The Ulster Covenant, the formation of the Ulster Volunteers, and the importation of guns demonstrated that Unionists were prepared to resist to the last in order to defend their position. The logic was clear. Carson and the Volunteers, in defying the government, were compelling them to back down or do the unthinkable, send troops to force subjects who were loyal to the king out of the nation they loved and into an arrangement that they feared. In taking these steps, Ulster Unionists were not on their own, but had powerful and influential supporters in Britain. However, as we have already heard, the intervention of the First World War meant that any conflict between Ulster and the forces of the Crown was avoided, and instead the men and weaponry which were in place to defend Ulster were used to defend the Empire. While events in Dublin in 1916 made independence more likely, events at the Somme were to make any betrayal of Ulster unachievable. The Curragh Mutiny demonstrated that the British Army was not willing to advance on loyal Ulster. The game was up, and a deal was eventually agreed. Ulster's stiff resolve and its stoic Ulster leaders had endured. Ulster had survived. Of course, it wasn't only the Unionists of Carson's era who have had their backs against the wall, and it was not only the Unionists of Carson's era who formed resistance to British government policy. In more recent years, albeit that time and circumstances had changed the means of resistance, Unionists under attack and pressed to accept that which they would have felt destructive of their citizenship, determined that it was right to say no. But that's another story and another lecture. I want this evening to reflect on what Unionism today can learn from Edward Carson and how we can ensure the inheritance that we have been granted can be secured for the next century. One thing that we can be sure of is that nothing stays the same. In my 40 years of politics, it's clear that only those who can adapt to changing circumstances remain standing. Carson recognised that, and the same is true of any identity or political philosophy. The key to continued success is to retain what is at the core of a philosophy, but not to become obsessed with that which is peripheral or transient. It would be foolish to imagine that Unionism has not changed over the last century, or that it will not change further over the next. That is how it survived, and that's how it will continue to prosper. What is important is that it has retained that which is fundamental. Partition vitally changed Unionism. What was once Irish Unionism, albeit with a separate identity for the northeast of the island, evolved to become Ulster or Northern Ireland Unionism. Edward Carson was unquestionably an Irish Unionist. And while the legacy of Edward Carson lives on, it may be regretted that the idea of Irish Unionism, in any meaningful sense, as historically defined, does not. I consider myself as an Ulster or Northern Ireland Unionist, not an Irish Unionist. The same would be true of the vast majority of Unionists in Northern Ireland. That's a significant change, not just from 100 years ago, but even from 50 years ago. The change in identity didn't come about overnight with the formation of the Northern Ireland state in 1921. Even as recently as 1950s, Unionist prime ministers were comfortable describing themselves as Irish. That identity continues to evolve in complex and indeed in fascinating ways. It is probably the case that most Unionists will identify their homeland as Northern Ireland, rather than using any other term, even Ulster. But for many centuries, Ulster was a place apart in Ireland. But until more recent decades, there was still a real sense of being Irish. I accept that there are some Unionists in Northern Ireland who are still relaxed identifying themselves as Irish, though they are a minority. And of course, they are welcome. Whereas Carson would have regarded himself as Irish and British, I believe that most Unionists today regard their identity as being from Northern Ireland and British. At the same time, it is interesting to note that St. Patrick's Day is now more widely celebrated across the community than has been the case for a very long period of time. The identity of what was Irish Unionism has morphed into Ulster Unionism, Northern Ireland Unionism, and even for some, Northern Irish Unionism. But no matter how people define themselves, the core of Unionism remains the same. As with any identity, or indeed any ideology, over time the true meaning or purpose can be obscured or even lost. We should remember that the Unionism of Edwards Carson was never exclusive or inward-looking, though too often that is how the media has portrayed Unionism over recent decades. There are many reasons why relations between Northern Ireland and what was to become the Irish Republic deteriorated in the early decades after partition, and there's probably plenty of blame to go around. As a general rule, people who see themselves under threat tend to be defensive. That's a natural response. And there's no doubt that events following the formation of the state, the increasingly belligerent approach of the then Irish government, and the threat of internal insurrection made it inevitable that the Unionist leaders of the day would turn inward rather than reaching out. Unionism, in its simplest form, is a desire to remain as part of the United Kingdom family. The precise reasons for that will differ. For me, it's a sense of history, culture, and identity. It is support for the institutions of the state, the monarchy, parliament, liberal democracy, and religious freedom. It's a way of life. But for others who don't share that emotional attachment, it may simply be a belief that it is in their best social or economic interest to remain as part of the United Kingdom. And yet again, there are some people who, while supporting the present constitutional arrangements, may not even choose to identify themselves as Unionists because of many of the historical connotations that come with the term. I believe that Unionism will be strongest if we are willing to accept as part of it a patchwork quilt of identity. Unionism is not a single homogeneous entity. It must be about opening up to new communities and building a broad and solid coalition. In saying Unionism must now reach out to others, I'm not in any way being critical of those who have led Unionism before me. I believe what has changed is not so much the aspiration of Unionist leaders, but the existence today of a much more benign environment. We now live in an era of peacetime Unionism. The success of the peace process, particularly in the last 5 years, has created new opportunities. The removal of the territorial claim, the IRA ceasefire, the acceptance of Northern Ireland's right to self-determination, the establishment of stable political structures, and the arrival of a sense of hope and confidence and anticipation have collectively created an environment within which we can use this space to put all our own political philosophies forward by advocating the positive virtues of our vision in a climate which allows people to weigh the strength of the proposition in the absence of the threat to violence. I embrace that freedom. I have confidence in the attraction of my Unionist vision for the future, and I'm convinced that it more than matches any alternative that exists. Ultimately, the majority must be able to determine the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. But if we have learned anything in recent years, it is that the minority must also feel secure within those arrangements, whilst maintaining their own right to seek democratic change. I said earlier that identity continues to evolve in complex and fascinating ways. What is most interesting is not how people from the Protestant community, but how those from a Catholic background are responding to the new dispensation. Separation over many generations has changed things for nationalists as well as for Unionists. Living in a separate political jurisdiction with different culture and everyday experiences is bound to make a difference over time. More importantly, I believe the fact that all sections of the population now play a full and active part in government has made a significant difference to perceptions of the state. Whereas once Stormont was seen as the preserve of only one section of our community, today it is shared space. And for all the difficulties that we experience on a day-to-day basis while seeking to govern with a coalition of 5 parties, the importance of widespread buy-in to the political institutions cannot be overstated. Make no mistake, I want to see our structures at Stormont reformed and normalised, and I want to see it done as quickly as is possible. But it must be on a basis which can command cross-community endorsement. In doing so, we must not undermine the widespread support for the institutions that presently exist. The Stormont Assembly and Executive, for all of its imperfections, is accountable to the people of Northern Ireland and in many ways has delivered better in spite of the recession than any of its predecessors. For countless years, there was a real fear on the part of Unionists that Nationalists would use their place in government to act as a fifth column to bring the state down. And some Nationalists still fear that given half a chance, Unionists would seek to set up an executive and assembly that would exclude and would act prejudicially to them. That Unionist fear in the last century prevented modest reform in the early decades after partition, just as it is probably true today that Nationalist fears are inhibiting significant reforms at Stormont. If people want to see change, then we must work to address those concerns. Now that a settlement has been reached and the threat has gone, we have entered a new political era. Numerous recent surveys have indicated growing support for Northern Ireland's present constitutional status and diminishing support for a united Ireland amongst Catholics. Any individual survey could be dismissed as an aberration, but the wider trend is unmistakable. The 2010 Northern Ireland Life and Times survey is just one example of this growing trend. When asked, do you think that the long-term policy for Northern Ireland should be for it to reunify with the rest of Ireland, only 16% of the population and only 33% of Catholics favoured this option. And we should remember that the question referred to the long term and not merely the immediate future. I believe that number is driven by the new political climate and our new relationship with the Republic. I've said on many occasions that from a party point of view, I want to see more Catholics supporting the DUP. I have no doubt that there are many Catholics in Northern Ireland who have much more in common with the social and economic policies of the DUP than they do with either Sinn Féin or the SDLP. And I welcome some early signs of modest progress. However, I suspect that the survey results do not point to any imminent avalanche of Catholics voting DUP, but rather outside party politics, to a wider acceptance of the present constitutional position of Northern Ireland and, as importantly, their place in it. That's not to say that they will feel comfortable calling themselves British or even defining themselves as Unionists, but they see their best future as part of Northern Ireland within its present constitutional context, as part of the United Kingdom. They might be classed as no-change advocates, but is it possible that we are seeing the birth of a new brand of Irish Unionism, a brand which is culturally Irish, but Unionist to the extent that they support the status quo of remaining within the United Kingdom? They may not yet, or indeed ever, identify themselves as such, but if not Irish Unionists is the name, they certainly are Irish Unionists in practice. For Unionism to prosper in the decades to come, it must be inclusive and not exclusive. I want to see a broad and inclusive Unionism that can embrace all shades of those who support Northern Ireland's present constitutional position. Unionism must reach far beyond its traditional base if it is to maximise its potential. That means forming a pro-union consensus with people from different religious and community backgrounds. When one reflects on the record of the last 100 years, it is remarkable the extent to which, for the most part, neither side sought to persuade or accommodate the other in a way which would have been in their own best long-term interests. Perhaps in the past circumstances contrived not to allow it, but today I want to see it change. John Hume often said that the strength of unionism lay in its numbers and its geography. That is, of course, right. But just think how our position as unionists would be strengthened if we were to reach out and draw into the ranks of the pro-union community those who, for whatever reason, may have felt excluded or unwanted in the past. This vision is entirely in tune with Edward Carson's vision as he set it out on the 4th of February 1921 at the Ulster Unionist Council. On that day, he said, "You will be a parliament for the whole community. We used to say that we couldn't trust an Irish parliament in Dublin to do justice to the Protestant minority. Let us take care that that reproach can no longer be made against your parliament, and from the outset let them see that the Catholic minority have nothing to fear from a Protestant majority. Let us take care that we win all that is best amongst those who have been opposed to us in this community. And so I say from the start, be tolerant to all religions, and while maintaining to the last your own traditions and your own citizenship, take care that similar rights are preserved for those who differ from us." Whatever the factors were that combined to miss that opportunity, let modern-day unionists put it into practice now. For almost all of our existence, unionists have been under threat of one form or another. But now, in this generation, we have an opportunity free from threats, internal or external. Perhaps not the first chance, but undoubtedly the best chance to put into practice what Edward Carson visualised. As a unionist, my raison d'etre is the union, and I want to see as many people from all backgrounds supporting it too. But we must ensure that all who live in Northern Ireland have equality of opportunity, whether they support the Union or favour a united Ireland. I value the relationship that I have with the present Irish government, and though we will not always agree, I know we will be able to work together to the benefit of our people. If I have learned anything over the last 40 years, it is that we will not have peace, progress and prosperity unless we can all benefit from it. As First Minister, I've sought to reach out to those outside my own tradition, not because it's expedient, but because it's the right thing to do. We have come through a period of conflict and upheaval, and the pieces in the kaleidoscope are happily moving into place. We have a golden opportunity to mould a new society before the new arrangements are firmly shaped and settled for future generations. That is the vista we now have. There is much that can be done, and there's much that can be improved. And I want to take advantage of this formative moment in a way that our forefathers either could not or did not. What I advocate is not some new variety of unionism, but the unionism advocated by Edward Carson. A unionism that can reach out and include those from every background. Maintaining Northern Ireland's position within the United Kingdom simply due to demographics should not be the height of our ambition. I want us to create a wide consensus for our present constitutional arrangements. In this new Northern Ireland, I want to see pro-union support grow, but in parallel, I want to ensure that no one, whatever their political and constitutional aspiration, is left behind. Edward Carson may now be consigned to the pages of history, but I believe he still speaks to us today. If this generation of unionists is listening, then let us work to broaden support for his vision of Northern Ireland's future. That vision of unionism, threatening to no one, open to all, living peacefully and in cooperation with our neighbours, will truly honour the bravery, the ideals, the sacrifice, the memory and the legacy of those who were counted when the challenge came all those years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for delivering the lecture on Edward Carson. You certainly didn't disappoint. It was thoughtful, reflective, challenging, occasionally provocative. Thank you very much indeed for delivering what I hope will be the first of a series of lectures hosted here in Iveagh House as part of the commemorations that we will have over the course of the of the next decade. We are commemorating events which occurred 100 years ago. I suppose looking around this room this evening, it would have been difficult to imagine 20 years ago that this event could have happened.